On September 1st, 1939, the world held its breath as the fragile piece of a continent is shattered in an instant. This was the day when darkness descended and the first shots of the deadliest conflict in human history rang out across the plains of Poland. The invasion of Poland was the beginning of World War II. What began as an invasion soon spiraled into a war that consumed the entire world.
Hello and welcome to today's video, which will be a slightly different adventure than my usual ones. In today's video, we will journey back in history to a time during World War II when Krakow found itself at the heart of a brutal conflict. From the Nazi occupation to the courageous acts of the Polish underground, we are going to uncover stories of survival, defiance, and the spirit of the Polish people here in Krakow. We are starting today's video here in the famous Jewish quarter Kazimierz. This Jewish quarter has a long history and was Poland's biggest Jewish quarter for many years. The first Jews settled down here in 1485, and there was a reason behind that. When the pest hit Poland, Christians were getting sick and a lot of people died, but Jewish people didn't get sick, or at least not as often as the Christians, and there were less Jewish people dying. The Christians thought that that was because the Jews were transmitting the pest. But actually the contrary was the case, because Jewish people simply had a better hygiene. They washed themselves more frequently and they also washed their clothes more frequently than the Christians. And therefore they didn't get sick as often as the Christians. Now here on this map we can see the Jewish quarter, which is this area here. Before, there used to be two smaller rivers here that separated the Jewish quarter from the rest of Krakow. And we can see the Vistula here, that is still here today, but the smaller rivers have gone by now. The Christians centered the Jewish people here in this quarter in order to separate them from the rest of the people here in Krakow. And the same thing happened again hundreds of years later during World War II for similar reasons, but a different motive. And we are going to explore that now. I am in front of a memorial for the 65,000 Jews that have died here in Krakow during World War II. This stone here is meant to remember the Jews of Krakow that have lost their lives here in the city. You can see that there are a lot of stones here below, and that is simply because this is a Jewish tradition. Jewish people, instead of flowers, they leave stones in front of the tombstones, and in order to remember their people, because flowers will die, but stones will stay forever. Let me now show you a typical housing in the Jewish quarter. We can see here behind me a huge patio that is typical for buildings in the Jewish quarter. For example, up there you can see the housings, the apartments that were rather small, and then down here a huge patio where people used to socialize. That is very important in the Jewish culture. You can see here on the walls, for example, the history of the Jewish ghetto here in Krakow. But one thing is very important. The Jewish quarter and the Jewish ghetto are two different things. We are currently here in the Jewish quarter. This is the ancient quarter where Jewish people used to live before the World War II. The Jewish ghetto is something we are going to visit next. It is a place that has been created by the Nazis. There the Jewish were forced to live in that area, and we are going to that area right now. We are now in front of a wall that you can see here behind me, which marks the Jewish ghetto. We are on the outside of the Jewish ghetto. Behind the wall, you will be inside of the ghetto. Now, this wall here has been started to build on March 3rd of 1941. And if you have a look at the wall, you can see that the top of it has half circles, and these half circles have the shapes of tombstones. So the Jewish people inside of these walls, they kind of had the feeling of being in a graveyard. And that is also kind of what the Jewish ghetto was. On contrary to the Jewish quarter that we have seen before, here in this ghetto, Jews were forced to live and work here. And before this place has become the Jewish ghetto, there were 3,000 Polish people who lived in this area. Once the ghetto has been formed, 15,000 Jews lived in this area. So you imagine under which circumstances the Jews had to live in an area that was made for 3,000 people, and suddenly there were 5 times as many people in that area. That meant that up to 3 to 5 families lived in one tiny apartment in little space. If they were lucky, some of them didn't even get an apartment and lived on the streets. The Jews were forced to work, and they had to work hard. They were given food, but very little. They received more or less 145 grams of food per day, which already is nothing. But later on, the governor of the Jewish ghetto, Hans Frank, ordered to serve them only 25 grams of food, which obviously had the objective to kill the people inside of the ghetto. Now, if you have a look at the wall, you can see probably that the walls are not that high. So everybody who wants to jump over it could probably do it with a little bit of effort. But first of all, the Jews that lived inside of the ghetto didn't know what was waiting for them outside of the walls. And second of all, with the little food they were given, obviously they also had a lack of energy to jump over these walls. A lot of people died of hunger, but also of cold, because here in Krakow it can get up to minus 25 degrees during the winter. And as mentioned before, a lot of people lived on the streets, so a lot of people also froze to death. Jewish people have been asked to come here to this square to be selected. Being selected meant they were being looked at by the Nazis here at this building behind me. They waited in line quite often for 6 hours or more, and they were hoping to get a stamp that was their allowance to stay here in the ghetto. This meant something great for the people, because if they wouldn't receive the stamp, it basically meant that they weren't able to work anymore, and therefore they were useless for the Nazis. Not receiving the stamps meant that they were deported to the extermination camps. So basically receiving the stamp meant they were able to keep living here in the ghetto, but also they stayed alive. The chairs that you can see are the symbol for the hope of the Jewish people that have been waiting here for hours. You can see that the chairs face different directions. Most of them face this direction. In that direction is the concentration camp of Krakow, which is the area where most Jews ended up in the end. And then we have a line of 7 chairs over there. These 7 chairs are facing the factories. Most of the factories have been in that direction over there, including the factory of Schindler. And here we have a chair that is alone. That is the only one that is actually facing this way. And here behind me you can see a street the chair is facing. And in this street the Nazis have shot Jews into the head and murdered them with basically no reason. With this ghetto, the Nazis gained the full control over the Jewish people. And they achieved that by lying to basically everyone. For example, to the Jews, they said by coming here, they would improve their lives. They would get work and they would get paid and they would have food here. In general, they would be safe in this area. To the Polish people, they said that they had to bring the Jews here to this area because they were sick and they were transmitting diseases. They constructed stories that made people believe that this really was the best for everybody. The objective of the Nazis obviously was to have power and control over the Jewish people. This way, they were able to control their lives, they were able to take away all of their belongings, especially those that were of value. But there have also been some heroes here in Krakow during World War II. There was one man who lived here in the Jewish ghetto who supported the Jews by hiding their things of value and also helped them to get false documents that meant to help them to get out of the ghetto. Besides that, the owner of the pharmacy kept the Jews informed about what was going on around the area and in Krakow and the world. The Jewish ghetto worked until the 13th of March in 1943, when it was liquidated. The Nazis entered into the ghetto and started to murder the Jews that lived here. Of the 15,000 Jews that lived here, 8,000 have been murdered here. 3,000 of them have been brought to the concentration camps. A lot of others died of cold or hunger, and only a few survived the Jewish ghetto. I am now in an area that actually looks like a residential area, which is what it is today. But if we have a look at this side here, it looks like a nice green space, maybe a little bit wild, but this area here has actually been a place where many crimes have been committed during World War II. All of this area here behind me used to be a concentration camp here in Krakow. A lot of tourists always go directly to Auschwitz because Auschwitz is the most famous concentration camp and was also the most deadliest one. So a lot of people skip this area here in Krakow because they don't even know that it does exist. But we are going to explore this area now together, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of this concentration camp. We can see a map here of the concentration camp. All of this area here in the red circle used to be the concentration camp Plaszow. Not far away from the concentration camp, you can find this building here, which used to be the house of Amon Goeth, who was the director of the concentration camp. Amon Goeth was known to be a very cruel person who shot Jews on the concentration camps without reason. He lived here in this building ever since the opening of the concentration camp in 1942. Later on, he was accused of corruption and ended up in prison. When the war ended, he tried to hide, but was later on found by the Americans and executed in 1946. We are now here in front of a memorial that has been constructed in order to remember everybody who died here in this concentration camp during World War II. That included all Jews, prisoners, and also Polish people that have died here. You can see the figures have a very heavy weight on their heads. And that weight is representing the hard work that they had to do here in the concentration camp. Then we can see a hole in their chest, which represents that the people here have suffered so much that basically all the suffering took away their hearts. The work that people had to do here in the concentration camp was extremely hard. They were carrying stones and rocks here that were produced for the Nazis. Besides that, executions have been taken out here in between 1943 and 1945. And the prisoners themselves were the ones that burned the bodies of the executed prisoners, Jews, Polish people, everybody that got executed here. Behind the memorial, we can see this hole here in the grass. And this was one of the mass execution places here of the concentration camp. There were 3 of them. Up here, the people that meant to be executed had to line up, and this is where they got shot and fell down into the hole. We are now in front of Schindler's factory here. I have mentioned Schindler before, and it is now time to tell you a little bit more about who was Oskar Schindler. Oskar Schindler was a German businessman and he was part of the SS. During the World War II, he lived here in Krakow and created this factory here behind me. Schindler became famous because he actually employed Jewish people, and by doing that, he saved the life of more or less 1,100 Jews that lived here in the Jewish Ghetto in Krakow during World War II. In front of the entry of the museum, you can see a wall with photos and names of the Jews that have been employed here in the factory. These were the Jews that were saved by Schindler. As mentioned before, Schindler was a businessman, and this whole story actually started just because Schindler wanted to make a good business and the highest profit possible. Schindler employed the Jews only because they were cheap. Jewish people during the time of World War II had a fixed salary and they were cheaper than Polish people. And therefore, Schindler started to employ a lot of them when he started this factory. Later on, his mindset changed a little bit because he realized what the Nazis did here with the Jewish people, and he also made relationships with his employees. He had an empathy for them, and this is why he started to save their lives. But let's get inside and talk a little bit more about how that happened. Schindler acquired this factory in 1939 with the help of Isaac Stern, a Jewish accountant that supported him. Schindler employed in total 1,700 people here at this factory. 1,000 of those were Jews, and a lot of those he employed at the beginning were saved later on by him. Here in this museum you can see the original offices, but you can also learn a lot about the history in general here in the Jewish Ghetto. Most of the Jews that have been employed here in the factory came from the Jewish Ghetto, which is only a few minutes of walking distance away from here. Here in this factory they produced pots and other things that the German army could use. Schindler was known to be a man who wanted the best for his workers. Here in the factory there was a kitchen for the workers, but also even a medical service and other benefits. With the liquidation of the Jewish Ghetto in 1943, Jewish people were deported to the concentration camps. A lot of them have been brought to the concentration camp here in Krakow. But since that one was quite far away from the factory, Schindler argued with the authorities to build up a sub-camp here in the factory. He said that this would increase the efficiency of his workers because they already had to work 12 hours per day here in the factory and the concentration camp was quite far away. His arguments as well as bribes have made this plan possible, and the Jewish workers of the factory have been allowed to stay here in the sub-camp, but but obviously they lived under way better conditions than in the concentration camp here in Krakow. When the Nazis also decided to liquidate the concentration camp, Schindler decided to move his factory to Brünnitz, and with that also his employees. By doing so, he saved about 1,100 lives of Jewish people. And we can see here in this area a lot of names on this wall here behind me. These are the names of the Jews that Schindler has saved.
In total, 65,000 Jews were murdered in Krakow. Only around 3,000 survived. Of those 3,000, 1,100 have been saved by Oskar Schindler.
Schindler has invested all of his money to save these 1,100 lives of the Jews. Even though at the beginning he created this factory to make business and to make money, in the end he realized that there was something way more valuable than money, and that is the life of innocent human beings. Now, with this beautiful and heroic story, I would like to finish today's video. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you've learned something. If you did, make sure to leave me a thumbs up and also leave your comments in the comment section below. I would love to hear your thoughts on the story of the heroes of Krakow. In the next video, I'm going to take you on a tour through Auschwitz. I hope to see you in the next video.